If you're listening to this at night, just settle in for a quiet story. And if you enjoy this kind of slow history, feel free to let me know in the comments. People often share what time of night they're listening from, and it's always interesting to see. In medieval Europe, winter didn't arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself with certainty or follow a calendar the way we expect today. Instead, it came slowly, almost quietly, as if the land itself was shifting into a different rhythm. People noticed it first in the air. Mornings felt sharper. Evenings arrived a little earlier each day. The wind carried a colder edge, one that seemed to cut through wool and wood alike. There were no forecasts, no warnings, only observation and experience passed down from older generations. Villages began to change their habits without needing to say it out loud. Farmers collected extra firewood while it was still manageable. Families started storing grains, dried vegetables, and salted meat. Nothing about this preparation felt dramatic. It was simply what had to be done to survive what everyone already understood was coming. Homes in that time were simple. Wood, clay, stone, and straw were the main materials. They were not designed for comfort in deep winter. They were designed for shelter, not insulation. So when the cold truly arrived, it found its way inside easily, slipping through cracks in walls and gaps in roofs. Because of that, the hearth became the center of life. One fire often supported an entire household. Cooking, warmth, light, and even conversation all gathered around that small, flickering source of heat. People stayed close to it, not for comfort alone, but for survival. As autumn faded, the days grew noticeably shorter. Work outside had to be finished earlier. Shadows stretched across fields that were slowly becoming quieter and emptier. Even sound itself seemed different, softer, as if the cold air absorbed it before it could travel far. And in that gradual silence, people understood something familiar, but always serious. Winter was approaching, and life would soon become smaller, slower, and more demanding. Not dramatic, not sudden, just steady and unavoidable. As night settles in, let's continue this quiet journey into the past. The world we're stepping into now is still, cold, and slowly changing in ways people could feel more than they could explain. The first snowfall in medieval Europe rarely felt like a dramatic event. It usually began without warning, sometime during a quiet morning or late afternoon. At first, it would be a few drifting flakes, almost uncertain, falling through the air as if testing the ground below. People would notice it in small moments, a pause in conversation, a glance out of a doorway, a child stopping mid-step. But life didn't stop immediately, not yet. It was still early, and snow in those first hours felt almost gentle. Then, slowly, the snowfall would grow heavier. The sky would lose its brightness, turning into a soft gray blanket that pressed down over fields, rooftops, and narrow village paths. By evening, everything familiar would begin to disappear beneath a thin but steady layer of white. The transformation was quiet but complete. Dirt roads became soft and uneven. Wooden fences softened under frost. Smoke from chimneys rose into still air without direction, as if the village itself had become suspended in silence. Inside the homes, nothing needed to be said. People understood what this meant. The first snow was not just a change in weather. It was the beginning of a longer, harder season. A season where movement became slower, resources mattered more, and survival required planning every single day. Families instinctively checked what they had stored. Grain sacks, dried herbs, salted meat, and firewood piles suddenly felt more important than they did just a week before. There was no panic, only quiet awareness. Everyone knew from experience that what was enough yesterday might feel small tomorrow. Outside, animals were guided closer to shelter. Chickens were gathered, goats and sheep were brought near barns or enclosed spaces. Even the sounds of animals began to fade as the snow deepened and the world outside grew quieter. By the time night arrived, the village felt different. Not empty, but softened. Lantern light flickered through small windows. Footsteps became rare. And the snowfall continued, covering everything evenly, patiently, as if erasing the outlines of the world. It was beautiful in a distant way, but everyone who had lived through it before knew the same truth. This was only the beginning. As we continue this slow journey into medieval winter life, the snow outside has now become more than just a light covering. It has begun to settle, to stay, and to change the rhythm of everything around it. In medieval villages, people didn't think of winter as a single season. They thought of it as a long period of endurance. And once the first snow stayed on the ground, preparation turned into something even more serious. During these early days, families focused on one thing above all else: survival planning. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't rushed. It was quiet, careful work done with the understanding that mistakes would not be easily corrected once deeper winter arrived. One of the most important tasks was food storage. Grain harvested months earlier was now carefully checked and protected from moisture and pests. Some of it was ground into flour and stored in sacks. Others were preserved in simple ways, drying, salting, or keeping in cool underground spaces when available. Meat was treated with equal care. Without refrigeration, preservation was everything. Salt became one of the most valuable resources during this time. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was survival itself. Meat that wasn't properly preserved would spoil quickly, especially as indoor fires created uneven warmth and humidity. Wood fire was another constant concern. People gathered as much as they could before snow made travel difficult. Forest edges became busy in a quiet way. No noise of machines, just the sound of axes, dragging logs, and careful stacking of wood near homes. Every log mattered, because once deep winter arrived, even short trips outside would feel difficult. Inside the houses, small adjustments began. Straw was placed in corners to reduce drafts. Cloths were hung over gaps in wooden walls. Beds were moved closer together, not only for warmth, but also to share body heat during the coldest nights. There was no sense of luxury in these preparations. Everything was practical. Everything had a purpose. And yet, despite all this effort, there was always a quiet understanding in the background of medieval life. No matter how well you prepared, winter would still take something from you. It might be comfort, it might be food, or it might simply be ease of living. Evenings grew longer now. Work ended earlier. People returned indoors as soon as the light began to fade. The world outside became less important with each passing day. And slowly, almost without noticing, life began to shrink into smaller spaces, closer to firelight, closer to shelter, closer to survival. As winter settles deeper into the land, one thing becomes more important than almost anything else: fire. In a medieval household, fire was not comfort or decoration, it was survival. Without it, everything slowed down. Food couldn't be cooked, rooms became unlivable, and the cold, especially at night, could become dangerous very quickly. Because of this, firewood collection was one of the most important tasks before and during winter. Families gathered wood whenever they could, early mornings, short afternoons, even during breaks in snowfall. It was never enough. It never felt like enough. Wood was stacked carefully near homes, sometimes under simple coverings to protect it from snow and moisture. Even slightly damp wood could be difficult to burn, and in a cold world, efficiency mattered. Inside the home, the fireplace became the center of everything. Most medieval houses had only one main hearth, often located in the middle or along a wall of the home. Around it, life quietly revolved. Cooking happened there. Bread, porridge, simple stews, all prepared over open flame. Light came from it as well, though weak and flickering. And when night fell, people gathered near it, not because it was comfortable, but because it was warm enough to make survival possible. But fire had its limits. It did not spread evenly through a house. One side of the room might feel warm while the other remained cold. Smoke often filled the air, especially in homes without proper chimneys. Eyes would sting, throats would feel dry, and yet people stayed close, because stepping away meant stepping into deeper cold. At night, families often slept near the fire or in rooms closest to it. Sometimes multiple generations shared the same space. Privacy was not a priority in winter. Warmth was. Outside, the village grew quieter each day. Snow absorbed sound, paths became harder to walk, and gathering firewood turned into a more difficult and time-consuming task. Still, every piece of wood brought home meant another hour of warmth, another meal cooked, another night endured. And so, fire became more than just heat. It became the quiet center of medieval winter life, steady, fragile, and always in need of care. As the winter deepens, let's step inside one of those medieval homes for a moment. Not the grand castles you might imagine, but the simple houses where most people actually lived. For most families in medieval Europe, a home was small, practical, and built from whatever materials were available: wood, mud, stone, and straw. It was not designed for comfort in the modern sense. It was designed to keep people alive. When you entered such a home in winter, the first thing you would notice was the air. It was not warm throughout the room. Instead, it changed depending on how close you were to the fire. Near the hearth, there was heat and light. A few steps away, the cold returned quickly. There was usually only one main room where most daily life happened. Cooking, eating, working, and resting all took place in the same space. Privacy was rare, especially during winter when everyone needed to stay close together for warmth. The floor was often just packed earth or rough stone. In colder months, straw or rushes might be spread across it to provide a little insulation. Over time, these layers would become worn, only replaced when absolutely necessary. Furniture was simple. Wooden benches, rough tables, and straw-filled mattresses or blankets were common. Beds, when available, were often shared. Families slept close together not just for comfort, but for survival. Body heat was one of the few reliable sources of warmth at night. Windows were small, sometimes just openings covered with cloth or animal hide. Glass was rare and expensive. Because of this, daylight was precious. As soon as the sun began to fade, the interior of the home would quickly turn dark, lit only by fire or a small oil lamp. Smoke from the hearth often filled the room slowly. Without proper chimneys in many homes, it would linger in the air, making eyes water and clothes absorb the smell of burning wood. But even that discomfort was accepted. It was part of winter life. Outside, the cold continued to build, pressing against the walls. Inside, people adapted in small ways, sitting closer, sharing blankets, and moving slowly to preserve warmth. Life in these homes was not easy, but it was steady, predictable in its own way. And in the deep silence of winter nights, with only firelight and breathing for sound, the home became less of a place of comfort and more of a shelter against everything outside it. As the medieval winter grows deeper, nights become the hardest part of the day. Not because of darkness alone, but because of what the darkness brings with it. Cold that settles into walls, floors, and even breath. In most medieval homes, sleep was not a private or personal experience the way we think of it today. It was shared. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, not for closeness, but for warmth. Beds were usually simple, straw-filled mattresses laid on wooden frames or directly on the floor. Blankets were thick when available, often made of wool, but even that was not always enough against the deep winter cold. So people adapted in the most practical way they could. They slept close together. Parents, children, sometimes even extended family members sharing space. The idea was simple. More bodies meant more heat. The fire, when it burned through the night, became a fragile protector, but it could not be fully trusted. Wood burned down. Flames weakened. Someone often had to wake during the night to add more fuel just to keep the cold from taking over completely. Even with fire, parts of the room stayed cold. The air near the ceiling might feel slightly warmer, while the floor remained icy. Breath could sometimes be seen in the air during the coldest nights, especially near walls or poorly sealed corners. Sleep itself was not always deep. People would wake often, sometimes from cold, sometimes from discomfort, sometimes simply out of habit. In a world without clocks or artificial light, sleep followed the rhythm of darkness and exhaustion rather than schedule. Clothing was often worn even in bed. Layers of wool, rough blankets, anything that could hold warmth. Removing too many layers could mean waking up freezing in the middle of the night. Outside, winter nights were even harsher. Wind moved through empty fields, snow pressed against wooden walls, and silence covered everything like a heavy blanket. It was a silence that felt complete, almost absolute. And yet, inside those small homes, life continued in its quiet form, breathing, sleeping, staying close together, waiting for morning. Morning did not bring comfort, but it brought relief. Another night had passed, another small victory against the cold. And, in medieval winter, that alone was enough to matter. As we move deeper into this medieval winter, one of the most important things keeping people alive was not the house and not even the fire. It was what they wore. Clothing in the Middle Ages was simple, practical, and completely dependent on what a family could produce or afford. There were no modern fabrics, no synthetic insulation, and no easy way to stay warm if you didn't prepare properly. The most common material was wool. Sheep were essential to survival in many regions, and their wool became the foundation of winter clothing. It trapped heat, resisted wind better than many other materials, and could be worn in layers to increase warmth. People didn't just wear one set of clothes. They layered them. A basic shirt or tunic underneath, followed by heavier wool garments, and then outer layers designed to block wind and moisture. In colder regions, animal skins or fur might be added when available, especially for those who could afford them. But for most ordinary peasants, clothing was not abundant. Many people owned only a few outfits in total. So winter clothing was often the same clothing worn year-round, just layered, patched, and adjusted for the season. Wet clothing was a serious problem. Snow could melt on fabric, leaving it damp, and damp clothing in freezing temperatures could quickly become dangerous. That's why people tried to stay dry as much as possible, even if it meant avoiding unnecessary travel. Footwear was another challenge. Shoes or boots were made of leather, sometimes stuffed with straw or cloth for extra insulation, but they were not fully waterproof, and walking through deep snow or mud could leave feet cold and soaked. Inside homes, people often kept their outer layers on, even near the hearth. Removing clothes might feel comfortable for a short time, but it risked losing warmth quickly once away from the hearth. Children wore similar layers, often adjusted from adult clothing. Nothing was specialized or fashionable in the modern sense. Everything had a purpose: to hold heat, block wind, and last as long as possible. Despite all this, cold still found its way in, through seams, through worn fabric, through long nights and frozen mornings. And yet, people endured it, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. In medieval winter, clothing was not about comfort. It was another layer of survival between life and the cold world outside. The world outside the village begins to feel smaller every day. At first, snow simply covers the ground, but as the days pass, it begins to harden, freeze, and reshape everything it touches. Paths that were once familiar turn uneven and unpredictable. Fields lose their clear edges. Roads slowly disappear beneath layers of ice and compacted snow. Travel, which was already slow in medieval times, becomes even more difficult. A short walk that once took minutes can now take much longer. Every step requires attention, watching for ice, deep snow, or hidden mud beneath the frozen surface. Villages begin to feel more isolated. In warmer months, people might travel between nearby settlements for trade, family visits, or supplies. But in deep winter, those journeys become rare. Not impossible, but carefully considered. Only the most necessary travel is attempted. This isolation changes the rhythm of life. News arrives slowly. Supplies are limited to what was stored beforehand. Communities rely more on themselves than on the outside world. In many ways, each village becomes its own small, self-contained world during the coldest months. Even sounds change. In snowy conditions, noise doesn't travel the same way. Footsteps are softened. Voices carry less distance. The usual background life of movement and activity fades into something quieter, almost muted. Animals also respond to the frozen landscape. Wild movement becomes less visible. Livestock remains closer to shelter. Even birds seem fewer in number, their presence reduced to occasional brief appearances in the cold air. Inside homes, people become more aware of distance. Even going outside for water, firewood, or basic tasks requires preparation. Clothing is layered carefully. Movements are planned. Nothing is done casually anymore. And yet, despite the restrictions, life continues. People adapt because they have to. Routine becomes survival. Every trip outside is measured against risk and necessity. Children may still find small moments of wonder in the frozen world, ice patterns on wood, snow piling against doors, or the quiet stillness of early morning. But adults see something else beneath it, the constant awareness that winter limits everything. The world has not stopped, but it has clearly narrowed. And within that narrowing, every action, every resource, and every decision begins to matter just a little more. As winter deepens further into medieval life, the days grow shorter and the nights begin earlier, almost without notice. By the time work outside is finished, darkness has already settled over the village, wrapping everything in a still, cold silence. Evenings become the longest part of the day during winter. With little daylight available, most outdoor tasks end quickly, and life moves indoors long before what we would consider late afternoon. Inside the home, the fire becomes the center of attention once again. It is not bright or powerful like modern heating. It is small, steady, and fragile. But in the darkness of winter, even a small flame feels important. People gather around it naturally, not for entertainment, but for warmth and light. Hands are warmed, simple food is prepared, and quiet conversation fills the space in a calm, unhurried way. There is no rush in these evenings. Time feels slower in winter. Without the pressure of outdoor work or travel, people move at a gentler pace. Repairing clothing, mending tools, or simply sitting together becomes part of the routine. Light inside the home is limited. Most families rely on firelight or simple oil lamps. Candles, when available, are used carefully because they are valuable and not always easy to obtain. This means the interior of the house is never fully bright. Instead, it glows softly in shades of orange and shadow. This low light changes how people experience the night. Everything feels closer. Voices are softer. Movements are slower. Even silence feels heavier, not in a frightening way, but in a calm, natural way that winter creates. Outside, the world is almost completely still. Snow absorbs sound, and the village becomes quiet enough that even distant noises seem far away. Wind occasionally moves through empty spaces, but it is not constant. Most of the time, there is only stillness. Families often stay close together during these evenings, not just for warmth, but because separation feels unnecessary in such conditions. Everyone shares the same space, the same light, the same small circle of heat from the fire. And as the evening stretches on, people slowly begin to prepare for sleep again. Another cold night ahead, another cycle of darkness and warmth, repeated again and again through the long winter months. In this quiet rhythm, medieval life continues. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily, one winter evening at a time. One of the most constant concerns in everyday life becomes food. Not abundance, not variety, but simply having enough to get through each day until spring returns. By this point in the season, most of what could be harvested or preserved earlier is already stored away. Families rely heavily on what was prepared months before the cold arrived. Every portion becomes more meaningful, every meal more intentional. Bread is one of the most common staples. It is often dense, simple, and made from whatever grain was available. Wheat, when possible, but also barley, rye, or mixed grains in poorer households. It is not soft like modern bread. It is heavy, filling, and meant to last. Alongside bread, people often eat porridge made from boiled grains. It is simple food, sometimes mixed with herbs or whatever vegetables could still be stored through winter. Warm meals like this were especially important during cold days, as they helped the body feel steadier in low temperatures. Salted or dried meat appears in some households, especially those with better access to livestock. Preservation through salt was essential. Without it, meat would spoil quickly. But salt itself was valuable, so even preserved meat was used carefully, not wasted. Vegetables were limited in winter. Some root vegetables, like turnips, onions, or carrots, could survive in storage, often kept in cool underground spaces or buried in straw. These small supplies became valuable sources of nutrition during the hardest months. Water also became more complicated. In freezing conditions, wells could ice over, and carrying water from frozen sources required effort. Sometimes snow was melted indoors to provide drinking water, though this also took firewood and time. Meals were not large or varied. They were practical, enough to maintain strength, enough to continue working, enough to survive another day of cold. There was also a quiet awareness around food during winter. Families often measured supplies mentally, estimating how long they might last. This was not done in fear, but in careful attention. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Children might not fully understand the calculations behind each meal, but they understood the feeling of winter food, simple, repetitive, and comforting in its own way. And despite the simplicity, food carried emotional weight. A warm bowl of porridge or a piece of fresh bread, even if plain, could bring a sense of relief in a season where comfort was otherwise rare. In medieval winter, food was not about enjoyment. It was about endurance. One meal, one day, one small step closer to spring. Food in the deep of winter becomes one of the most constant concerns in everyday life. Not abundance, not variety, but simply having enough to get through each day until spring returns. By this point in the season, most of what could be harvested or preserved earlier is already stored away. Families rely heavily on what was prepared months before the cold arrived. Every portion becomes more meaningful, every meal more intentional. Bread is one of the most common staples. It is often dense, simple, and made from whatever grain was available. Wheat when possible, but also barley, rye, or mixed grains in poorer households. It is not soft like modern bread. It is heavy, filling, and meant to last. Alongside bread, people often eat porridge made from boiled grains. It is simple food, sometimes mixed with herbs or whatever vegetables could still be stored through winter. Warm meals like this were especially important during cold days, as they helped the body feel steadier in low temperatures. Salted or dried meat appears in some households, especially those with better access to livestock. Preservation through salt was essential. Without it, meat would spoil quickly, but salt itself was valuable, so even preserved meat was used carefully, not wasted. Vegetables were limited in winter. Some root vegetables like turnips, onions, or carrots could survive in storage, often kept in cool underground spaces or buried in straw. These small supplies became valuable sources of nutrition during the hardest months. Water also became more complicated. In freezing conditions, wells could ice over, and carrying water from frozen sources required effort. Sometimes snow was melted indoors to provide drinking water, though this also took firewood and time. Meals were not large or varied. They were practical, enough to maintain strength, enough to continue working, enough to survive another day of cold. There was also a quiet awareness around food during winter. Families often measured supplies mentally, estimating how long they might last. This was not done in fear, but in careful attention. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Children might not fully understand the calculations behind each meal, but they understood the feeling of winter food, simple, repetitive, and comforting in its own way. And despite the simplicity, food carried emotional weight. A warm bowl of porridge or a piece of fresh bread, even if plain, could bring a sense of relief in a season where comfort was otherwise rare. In medieval winter, food was not about enjoyment. It was about endurance. One meal, one day, one small step closer to spring. Smoke, heat, and the air you breathe. In medieval winter, warmth came with a trade-off that people accepted as normal, even if it was uncomfortable: smoke. Inside most homes, the same fire that gave heat and light also filled the air with smoke. Chimneys, when they existed, were often simple and not very efficient. In many houses, smoke drifted through the room before slowly escaping through roof openings or cracks in the walls. This meant that indoor air was rarely clean. On cold days, especially when fires burned continuously, a light haze could hang inside the home. Eyes might sting slightly, and clothes would always carry the smell of burned wood. But no one treated this as unusual. It was simply part of winter life. People learned to position themselves around the fire in ways that balanced warmth and smoke. Sitting too close could mean breathing more smoke. Sitting too far meant losing heat. Over time, families found their own patterns, specific spots in the room that felt right for different times of day. The fire itself required constant attention. Wood had to be added regularly, but not too much at once. Too little, and the flame would weaken. Too much, and smoke would increase. Someone in the household was almost always responsible for watching it, especially during long winter days. Heat distribution inside these homes was uneven. The area directly near the hearth could feel almost comfortable, while corners of the room remained cold and still. This created a natural gathering pattern, where everyone slowly drifted toward the center of warmth. At night, when the fire was reduced or carefully maintained, the temperature inside the house would drop again. The cold never fully left. It only paused briefly near the flame. Even clothing absorbed the effects of smoke and fire. Wool garments held the smell of burning wood. Hair and blankets carried it too. Over time, it became part of the sensory memory of winter, something people associated with warmth, shelter, and survival. Despite these discomforts, fire remained essential. Without it, winter nights would be unbearable. So people tolerated smoke, dryness, and irritation because the alternative was far worse. Outside, the world continued its frozen silence. Inside, life continued in a smoky glow of orange light and shared heat. It was not perfect, but it was enough to keep the cold at bay, one fire-lit room at a time. As winter deepens further, something subtle but powerful begins to change the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. The nights become longer than the days in a way that feels almost endless. Even before sunset, a quiet urgency settles over villages. People finish their outdoor tasks earlier, not because they want to, but because there was less light to work with. The sun seems to leave the sky too quickly, as if time itself has been shortened. By the time evening arrives, darkness is already heavy. There is no gradual transition like we experience today with electric lighting. Instead, daylight fades into night in a slow but undeniable retreat. And once it is gone, the world becomes still and quiet. Inside homes, life shifts to a slower pace. Without daylight, there is little left to do except gather near the fire, prepare simple meals, and wait for sleep to arrive. Work pauses naturally because visibility is limited and warmth must be preserved. Time in these evenings feels different. Without clocks or artificial light, people lived more closely with natural cycles. And in winter, those cycles stretched longer than usual. A single evening could feel like a long, quiet pause in life. Families often sat together in near silence at times, not because there was nothing to say, but because winter encouraged stillness. Conversations became shorter, softer, more spaced out. The sound of crackling wood and wind outside filled the gaps between words. Children sometimes tried to stay awake longer, but the warmth of the fire and the heaviness of winter air made sleep unavoidable. Adults also followed this rhythm, resting earlier simply because there was little else to do in darkness. Outside, the village was almost completely swallowed by night. Snow reflected faint starlight, making the landscape appear dimly visible, like a faded memory of daytime. Wind occasionally moved through open spaces, but most of the time, everything remained still. These long nights shaped the emotional experience of winter. They were not frightening, but they carried a sense of depth and quietness that was hard to escape. Time felt stretched, as if each hour lasted longer than usual. And yet, within this stillness, life continued in its smallest forms, breathing, resting, warming, waiting. Because in medieval winter, the night was not just a time of darkness. It was a long, quiet space where survival paused and tomorrow slowly waited to arrive. Winter does not only affect the land and homes, it begins to affect the human body as well. Illness during this time was common, especially among the poor and those living in crowded, smoky homes. The combination of cold air, limited nutrition, and long nights made the body more vulnerable than in warmer seasons. People did not understand germs the way we do today. Instead, illness was often seen as something caused by imbalance, cold entering the body, bad air, or simply exhaustion from long winters. Whatever the explanation, the reality remained the same. People became sick more often during these months. Coughs and fevers were especially common. A simple cold could linger for weeks, weakening someone slowly rather than striking all at once. Breathing cold air, sleeping in damp conditions, or sitting too far from the fire could all contribute to discomfort that lasted far longer than expected. For children and older adults, winter was particularly difficult. Their bodies had less strength to resist illness, and recovery was slower. In many households, winter carried a quiet awareness that not everyone who entered the season would come out of it in the same condition. Medical care in medieval times was limited. Local healers, herbs, and traditional remedies were often the first response. Hot drinks made from plants, simple poultices, or rest near the fire were common methods of care. But there were no real cures for many illnesses we now consider simple. Still, families did what they could. Warmth was considered essential for recovery. A sick person would often be kept closest to the fire, wrapped in blankets, given light food, and allowed to rest as much as possible. But rest was not always easy in crowded homes. Smoke, noise, and cold drafts made healing uncomfortable. And because food was limited, recovery sometimes depended more on patience than treatment. Despite all of this, life continued around illness. Daily tasks still needed to be done. Fire still needed tending. Food still needed preparing. Winter did not pause for sickness, and neither could survival. There was also a quiet emotional weight to winter illness. Families would watch each other more carefully during this season, aware that small changes in health could become serious over time. And yet, many did recover. Slowly, gradually, as spring approached and the body regained strength with better weather and more food. In medieval winter, illness was not unusual. It was simply another part of surviving the cold season. Quiet, difficult, and always present in the background of daily life. Animals' survival is not only a human struggle. Animals, both domestic and wild, are also shaped by the cold in ways that directly affect everyday village life. For most households, livestock was essential. Chickens, goats, sheep, pigs, and sometimes cattle were not just food sources, they were long-term survival assets. But in winter, keeping them alive became a serious challenge. Feed was limited. Grass no longer grew in frozen fields, so animals relied on stored hay, leftover crops, or whatever could be spared from human supplies. Every handful of feed had to be measured carefully because wasting food meant risking both human and animal survival later in the season. Shelter became just as important as food. Barns were used to protect animals from wind and snow, but in many cases, space was limited. In especially harsh winters, smaller animals like chickens or goats might even be brought closer to human living areas to share warmth. This created a very different living environment compared to modern expectations. Humans and animals often lived in close proximity during winter months. It was not unusual for the smell, sound, and presence of livestock to be part of daily indoor life. At night, the warmth generated by animals in enclosed spaces could help stabilize temperature slightly. It was not comfortable, but it was practical. In a world without reliable heating, every source of warmth mattered. Outside the village, wildlife also adapted. Many animals migrated or reduced activity during winter. Others, like wolves in certain regions, became more noticeable as they searched for food. This added an extra layer of awareness for those traveling or living near forested areas. Even birds changed their patterns. Some disappeared entirely during the coldest months, while others gathered in smaller groups, surviving on whatever seeds or scraps they could find. For villagers, animal survival was directly tied to human survival. A failed harvest of hay or loss of livestock could mean food shortages later in the season or even into the following year. Because of this, animals were treated with a careful balance of necessity and responsibility. They were not pets in the modern sense, but they were also not simply disposable. Their survival mattered. And so, winter life became a shared experience between humans and animals, both trying to endure the same cold, both relying on limited resources, both waiting for the return of spring. In the quiet of snowy nights, the sounds of breathing, movement, and shelter became part of the same fragile rhythm of survival. The slow weight of winter days. Something subtle begins to change in the way people experience time itself. Days feel heavier, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet accumulation of cold, repetition, and limited movement. Each morning begins with the same routine: checking the fire, assessing the cold air leaking through walls, and planning the simplest tasks for survival. There is no rush in winter, not because life is easy, but because speed, the slow weight of winter days. Something subtle begins to change in the way people experience time itself. Days feel heavier, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet accumulation of cold, repetition, and limited movement. Each morning begins with the same routine: checking the fire, assessing the cold air leaking through walls, and planning the simplest tasks for survival. There is no rush in winter, not because life is easy, but because speed itself becomes difficult. Cold slows the body, snow slows movement. Even simple actions require preparation and thought. Outside tasks are carefully timed: firewood collection, fetching water, checking animals. Everything is done in short intervals, often between periods of returning indoors to warm up again. No one stays outside longer than necessary. Inside the home, the rhythm of the day is steady but quiet. Cooking, repairing clothing, maintaining tools. These small tasks fill the hours that would otherwise feel empty. Without modern distractions or entertainment, time is experienced in a more direct way. Light plays a major role in shaping the day. With short daylight hours, most productive work must be done quickly. As soon as the sun begins to fade, activity slows naturally. Darkness signals rest, reflection, and conservation of warmth. There is also a mental effect to long winters. The repetition of similar days creates a sense of stillness in life. Nothing moves quickly forward. Instead, each day feels like a continuation of the last, slightly colder, slightly darker, but fundamentally the same. Yet within this repetition, people adapt. They find small patterns of comfort: a familiar seat near the fire, a regular routine for meals, a predictable order to daily tasks. These small consistencies help structure life in a season where everything outside feels uncertain. Communication within households becomes minimal but meaningful. Words are used carefully. Silence is common, not out of sadness, but out of conservation, of energy, of warmth, of attention. And even thoughts begin to slow in a different way during these long days. People observe more, react less, and exist more closely within their immediate environment. And as winter continues, this slow weight of daily life becomes the background of everything. Not overwhelming, but constant. A steady presence that defines how each moment is lived. In medieval winter, days do not disappear. They simply move more slowly, one quiet hour at a time. Winter work and quiet labor. As winter settles even deeper into medieval life, work does not stop, it simply changes shape. The fields outside may be frozen and still, but inside homes and around small sheltered spaces, life continues through quieter, slower labor. Unlike warmer seasons, winter is not about expansion or harvest, it is about maintenance. People focus on keeping what already exists from falling apart. This shift entires the rhythm of daily activity. One of the most common winter tasks is repair work. Clothing that was worn and patched during autumn is now mended again. Wool garments are stitched, reinforced, and reused. Nothing is wasted if it can still serve a purpose. Even small scraps of fabric are saved because material is too valuable to discard. Tools also receive attention during this season. Wooden handles are checked for cracks, metal edges are cleaned and sharpened. Farmers and workers prepare for the eventual return of spring by making sure everything will still function when needed again. Indoor spaces require their own form of labor. Floors are readjusted with fresh straw when available. Storage areas are reorganized. Firewood is brought in gradually and stacked carefully so it remains dry and usable. These tasks are simple but necessary for daily survival. Spinning and weaving are also common winter activities, especially for women in many medieval households. Wool is processed into thread and fabric during long evenings, turning raw materials into something useful for clothing and blankets. This kind of work fits naturally into the slower pace of winter days. Even children contribute in small ways. They may help gather small pieces of wood, assist with simple chores, or watch over younger siblings. Winter life is communal by necessity. Everyone plays a part, no matter how small. Outside work is limited, but still important. Short trips for water, checking livestock, or collecting additional fuel continue despite the cold. Each journey is brief, planned, and focused, because exposure to winter air for too long is difficult to endure. What defines winter labor most is not intensity, but consistency. The same small tasks repeat day after day, forming a steady rhythm that carries households through the season. There is no urgency in these actions. Instead, there is patience, a quiet understanding that winter cannot be rushed, only endured. And so, in the stillness of snow-covered landscapes, medieval life continues not through grand effort, but through small, repeated acts of care and survival. The evenings begin to feel longer than the rest of the day, not because time itself changes, but because activity becomes so limited that each hour feels stretched and still. Once the sun disappears early in the afternoon, there is little left to do outside. Snow, cold, and fading light naturally push life indoors, and so most of the day's remaining hours are spent within the same small space around the same small fire. Inside the home, the atmosphere is steady and quiet. The fire burns low and constant, offering both warmth and a soft glow that shapes the entire room. Shadows move slowly across wooden walls. The air feels warm near the hearth and colder toward the edges of the room. Without modern distractions or entertainment, evenings were shaped by simple human presence. People sat together, often in silence for long stretches of time. Not every moment needed words. In fact, silence was often more comfortable in winter than conversation. When people did speak, it was usually in short, practical exchanges, plans for the next day, observations about weather, small reminders about tasks. Nothing rushed, nothing unnecessary. But winter evenings also allowed space for reflection. Without the pressure of constant work or travel, the mind naturally slowed down. People would think about family, past seasons, and the uncertainty of the months ahead. In many households, storytelling became a quiet part of winter life. These were not performances, but simple recollections, memories passed between generations. Stories about past winters, local history, or personal experiences helped fill the long hours of darkness. Sometimes, people also engaged in small crafts during these evenings. Mending cloth, carving wood, or spinning thread were common tasks that could be done in low light near the fire. These activities kept hands busy while minds remained calm. Children often struggled to stay awake for long. The combination of warmth, low light, and steady atmosphere naturally encouraged sleep. Adults, too, would rest earlier than in other seasons, simply because there was little reason to stay active after darkness settled. Outside, the village was almost completely still. Snow covered the ground evenly. Wind was occasional, not constant, and the world beyond the firelight felt distant, almost unreachable. These long evenings did not feel empty to the people living them. They felt complete in their own way, quiet, steady, and predictable.
And in that predictability, medieval winter life found a rhythm that carried people gently from one night to the next until morning returned once again. When darkness fully arrives, it feels almost absolute. There are no distant lights from cities, no glowing roads, no artificial glow breaking the horizon. Once the fire dims and the shutters are closed, the world outside disappears almost entirely. Inside the home, the last remaining light usually comes from the hearth. Its glow is soft and unstable, flickering against wooden walls and casting slow-moving shadows across the room. Everything feels closer in this light. People, objects, even silence itself. And silence becomes the most noticeable part of winter nights. Without insects, without movement in fields, without the usual sounds of daily activity, the world outside feels almost frozen in sound as well as temperature. Even wind is occasional rather than constant, arriving in brief moments before fading again. Inside, people become aware of small sounds that would normally go unnoticed. The crack of burning wood, the shifting of straw bedding, the faint creak of wooden beams as the house settles into the cold. These sounds do not feel unsettling. Instead, they become part of the rhythm of the night, a reminder that life continues even in stillness. Sleep in winter arrives early and slowly. There's no rush to stay awake, no reason to extend the day. Once tasks are complete and the fire is settled, people naturally move toward rest. The body responds to the cold by conserving energy, and sleep becomes both necessity and relief. But even sleep carries interruptions. The fire may need attention during the night. Cold drafts may shift through the room. Someone might wake briefly, adjust a blanket, or add wood before returning to rest. Despite these interruptions, there is a steady comfort in knowing that everyone is together, sharing the same space, the same warmth, the same quiet protection against the outside cold. Outside, the world remains unchanged through the night. Snow lies still on rooftops and fields. Paths are hidden under layers of white. The village rests beneath a heavy, unmoving sky. And in this silence, time feels suspended, not stopped, but slowed to the quietest version of itself. As winter continues across medieval Europe, one of the first things people begin to lose is freedom of movement. Travel, which in warmer months was already slow and tiring, becomes even more difficult once snow and ice take over the landscape. Roads that once connected villages now disappear beneath uneven layers of frozen ground. At first, snow simply makes paths harder to follow. But as temperatures drop further, that snow compacts and freezes, turning soft ground into something firm, slippery, and unpredictable. Walking becomes careful work. Every step requires attention. A hidden patch of ice can send someone off balance. Deep snow can slow movement to a crawl. Even short journeys begin to feel like small challenges. Because of this, people travel less during winter unless absolutely necessary. Trips between villages are reduced. Markets are visited only when essential. Many families prefer to stay within their own settlement for weeks at a time. This creates a natural isolation. Each village becomes more self-contained, relying on stored supplies and internal resources rather than outside exchange. When travel does happen, it is usually planned carefully. People dress in extra layers, carry necessary tools, and often travel in daylight hours only. Moving in darkness or during storms is avoided whenever possible. Snowstorms add another layer of difficulty. Visibility drops quickly, and familiar landmarks disappear. In such conditions, even experienced travelers can lose direction or become delayed far longer than expected. Animals used for travel, such as horses or donkeys, also struggle with frozen paths. Their movement becomes slower, and extra care is needed to keep them safe from slipping or exhaustion. Inside villages, the absence of travel changes the feeling of connection to the outside world. News arrives slowly, sometimes delayed for days or weeks. Supplies that cannot be produced locally become more precious. And yet, this isolation is not always viewed negatively. It also brings a sense of containment, where life becomes simpler, more focused on immediate surroundings rather than distant concerns. People begin to live within a smaller world, one defined by the village, the home, and the short distance between them. In medieval winter, travel is not impossible, but it is no longer easy. And so the world quietly contracts, one frozen road at a time. As winter settles firmly over the medieval landscape, even the movement of trade begins to slow. Markets, which in warmer months are full of sound, exchange, and activity, become quieter or reduced in frequency. In many regions, regular weekly or seasonal markets continue in a limited way, but travel conditions often determine how active they can be. If roads are blocked by snow or ice, traders simply cannot arrive, and the flow of goods becomes irregular. This affects daily life more than it might seem at first. Medieval communities depended heavily on local production, but certain goods, salt, iron tools, cloth, or special grains, often came from outside villages. When trade slows, these items become harder to replace. As a result, people begin to rely more on what is already within their homes and storage. Repairs are favored over replacement. Old tools are carefully maintained instead of exchanged. Clothing is mended repeatedly rather than replaced with new fabric. When small winter markets do take place, they are usually modest and practical. A few stalls, a limited selection of goods, and shorter hours due to daylight constraints. There is little decoration or excess, just exchange based on necessity. The atmosphere of these winter gatherings is different from other seasons. There is less noise, fewer people, and a more deliberate pace. Conversations are brief and focused on practical matters, prices, availability, and conditions of travel. Merchants who do travel during winter take calculated risks. Journeys are slower, more dangerous, and often dependent on weather conditions. Snowstorms or frozen paths can delay them for days, making timing uncertain. For villagers, each arrival of goods during winter feels important. Even small deliveries of salt, cloth, or tools can make a noticeable difference in household planning. But there is also an awareness that nothing can be guaranteed until spring improves travel conditions. And so, winter creates a kind of pause in trade, not a complete stop, but a slowdown that affects everything connected to it. The rhythm of exchange becomes irregular, shaped by weather rather than schedule. Inside homes, people adjust accordingly. Supplies are used more carefully. Consumption is planned with the understanding that replacement may not be immediate. In this way, winter does not just change the landscape, it also changes the flow of connection between communities. And for a time, the world of trade becomes smaller, quieter, and more dependent on patience than movement.
Simply moves indoors and becomes quieter, slower, and more repetitive. With fields frozen and travel limited, households turn their attention to tasks that can be done within the warmth of the home. Every day brings a small list of responsibilities that help maintain survival through the cold months. One of the most common forms of winter work is repair. Clothing that has been worn and mended throughout the year is carefully stitched again. Wool garments are patched, seams are reinforced, and damaged items are adjusted to last a little longer. Nothing is replaced unless absolutely necessary. Tools also receive attention during this time. Knives are sharpened, wooden handles are repaired, and small household items are fixed rather than discarded. In a world where resources are limited, repair is always more valuable than replacement. Food preparation continues as well, but in smaller, more controlled ways. Stored grain is checked,
Dried goods are sorted, and remaining supplies are carefully measured. Families often plan meals in advance to ensure nothing is wasted. Spinning and weaving are especially important winter activities. Wool is turned into thread, and thread into fabric, slowly and steadily over long evenings. This work is not rushed. It fits naturally into the quiet rhythm of the season. Even children contribute in small ways, helping with simple tasks like gathering small pieces of wood, carrying items, or assisting with household chores. Every member of the household plays a role, no matter how small. Outside tasks are rare but still necessary. Short trips for water, firewood, or animal care continue, but they are carefully timed and completed quickly. Exposure to cold air is minimized whenever possible. The overall rhythm of winter work is not about productivity in the modern sense. It is about maintenance, keeping life steady until conditions improve. And so days pass in a gentle repetition of small, necessary actions. Not fast, not dramatic, but steady enough to carry life through the cold. The evenings feel less like a part of the day and more like a long, extended pause in time. Once the sun disappears, darkness settles in quickly, and with it comes a deep stillness that defines winter life. Inside homes, the fire remains the only steady source of light. Its glow is soft and uneven, casting moving shadows across wooden walls and simple furniture. Everything feels closer around it. People, objects, even silence itself. With limited light and no real need to stay active, evenings become slow and unstructured. There is no rush to finish tasks, no pressure to move quickly. Instead, people simply exist in the same shared space, letting the hours pass naturally. Conversation, when it happens, is quiet and unhurried. It often consists of small observations or simple exchanges. There is no need for constant speech. In fact, silence is often more comfortable during these long winter evenings. For many, this is a time of reflection. Without the distraction of outdoor labor or travel, the mind naturally slows down. Thoughts turn inward, towards family, memories of warmer seasons, or quiet anticipation of spring. Children usually fall asleep early, drawn in by warmth and stillness. Adults may remain awake a little longer, but even they are guided by the rhythm of the fire and the heaviness of winter air. The soundscape of these evenings is minimal. A crackling fire, occasional movement, the faint settling of wooden structures. Outside, snow absorbs most sound, making the world beyond the walls feel distant and unreachable. This quietness is not emptiness. It is a kind of steady background that shapes how time is experienced. Hours pass without urgency, each one blending into the next. And as the night deepens, the household gradually prepares for rest once again. Another day in winter slowly comes to an end, not with noise or conclusion, but with silence and stillness. The combination of cold air, limited nutrition, and crowded indoor living creates conditions where the body struggles to stay strong. Even a simple cough or fever can last longer than expected, slowly draining energy over days or weeks. Medieval people did not understand illness in the way modern medicine explains it. Instead, they often saw it as an imbalance in the body or a reaction to cold air and bad conditions. Whatever the belief, the experience was the same. Winter made recovery slower and daily life harder. Homes, while warm near the fire, were not fully protected from cold drafts. Smoke-filled air, uneven heating, and limited ventilation could make indoor conditions uncomfortable, especially during long periods of illness. When someone became sick, they were usually kept close to the fire. Warmth was considered essential for recovery. Families would provide simple care, warm drinks, light food, rest, and constant attention when possible. But rest was not always easy in a busy household. Even in illness, life continued around the sick person. Fire still needed tending, food still needed preparing, and other family members still had tasks to complete. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable during winter. Their bodies were less able to handle the strain of cold and limited food. Families often watched them more carefully during this season, aware of how quickly health could change. Herbal remedies and traditional treatments were commonly used. These were based on local knowledge passed down through generations. While not always effective by modern standards, they represented the best available care at the time. Despite these challenges, many people did recover slowly as conditions improved or as their bodies adjusted. Recovery often depended as much on time and rest as on any treatment. Winter illness was not unusual or expected in medieval life. It was simply another part of the season, something that existed quietly alongside cold nights, limited food, and long evenings. And so life continued, carefully balanced between endurance and vulnerability, until the warmth of spring could finally begin to return.
For them, winter often began with curiosity. The first snow could feel like something new and almost magical. A world that once looked familiar suddenly became soft, bright, and quiet. Footprints in fresh snow, frost on wooden fences, and frozen breath in the morning air all felt like small discoveries. But that sense of wonder was always balanced by reality. Children were quickly reminded that winter was not just for play. Cold hands, wet clothing, and thin protection from the weather made outdoor time short and carefully managed. Most children wore simple, layered clothing similar to adults, often adjusted from older garments. Warmth mattered more than appearance. Wool was essential, and anything that could trap heat was used repeatedly throughout the season. Inside the home, children spent much of their time near the fire, just like the adults. But their days were not idle. Even in winter, they were expected to help in small ways, carrying wood, assisting with chores, or watching younger siblings. Education, in the modern sense, did not exist for most, but learning still happened through daily life. They observed adults, learned skills gradually, and absorbed the routines of survival through repetition. Food during winter was simple for children as well. The same meals, bread, porridge, soups, were shared by everyone. There were no special provisions, only portions adjusted based on availability. Sleep came earlier for children, especially during long winter nights. The combination of warmth, limited light, and physical exhaustion naturally guided them toward rest soon after evening began. Illness was a constant concern. Children were more sensitive to cold, and recovery was slower. Because of this, families often kept them closer to warmth and watched them carefully during the harshest weeks of winter. Still, despite the difficulties, children found small moments of joy. A clear morning after snowfall, the sound of crunching ice, or simple indoor games shared in low light could bring brief relief from the heaviness of the season. Their world was small during winter, but it was not empty. It was shaped by warmth, routine, and the quiet resilience of growing up in a season that demanded patience from everyone, even the youngest.
Time begins to feel less like something measured by hours and more like something felt through routine, sound, and light. One of the few steady markers of time during this season comes from the church bell. In many villages, the bell serves not just a religious purpose, but also a practical one. It signals gatherings, marks important moments of the day, and reminds people of rhythm in a season where daylight is limited. Even in the deep cold, when snow covers roads and silence fills the air, the sound of a bell carries farther than most other noises. It cuts through the stillness in a way that feels clear and familiar, briefly connecting scattered homes into a shared moment. Winter church attendance varies depending on weather conditions, but when possible, people still gather. The journey itself can be difficult, walking through snow, facing cold winds, and navigating uneven frozen paths. Yet many still make the effort when conditions allow.
Inside the church, the atmosphere is often warmer than outside, though still simple and unheated in many places. The gathering of people alone brings a sense of shared warmth. Light from candles or small lamps flickers softly, creating a calm and steady environment. These moments offer a brief break from the isolation of winter life. For a short time, people are no longer separated by homes and distance. They sit together, listen together, and experience the same quiet space. Outside of these gatherings, time remains largely defined by natural cycles. The sun rises late and sets early. Shadows move slowly across snow-covered ground. Days feel shorter, not in measurement, but in experience. The bell, therefore, becomes more than a sound. It becomes a reminder that life is still structured even in the coldest months, that there is still order beneath the silence of winter. And when the sound fades again into the cold air, the village returns to its usual stillness, homes, fires, and quiet routines, continuing as before. In this way, even winter's silence is occasionally broken by something steady, a simple bell, a shared moment, a reminder that time is still moving forward.
These are not formal stories or performances. They are quiet recollections shared by people who already know each other well. A memory from childhood, a tale passed down from an older generation, or an account of a past winter that felt just as long and difficult as the current one. Storytelling in winter served a gentle purpose. It helped fill the long hours of darkness, but more than that, it created a sense of connection. In a season where isolation was common, hearing another voice, another experience, made the world feel slightly less closed in. Often, these stories were repeated many times before. Familiar tales did not need to be exciting to be meaningful. In fact, repetition itself became comforting. Knowing how a story ended was part of what made it feel safe and steady during uncertain nights. Children would sometimes listen quietly, even if they had heard the same stories before. Adults would speak slowly, choosing words carefully, not to impress, but to maintain the calm atmosphere of the room. Alongside storytelling, simple forms of reflection naturally emerged. People would recall past winters, how cold they were, how food was managed, who helped whom during difficult times. These memories were not shared to dwell on hardship, but to quietly acknowledge endurance. In many ways, storytelling became a way of preserving time. Without books or widespread written records in everyday homes, spoken memory carried much of what people knew about their families, villages, and local history. The fire remained central during these moments. Its steady presence provided light, warmth, and a natural focus for attention. As it burned lower, voices softened, and the room gradually returned to silence. Not every evening included storytelling. Sometimes people simply sat together without speaking, sharing the same space and warmth. Both silence and speech had their place in winter life. And as the night continued, stories eventually gave way to sleep, just like every other part of the day. But even after words faded, something remained. A shared sense of presence, and the quiet memory of voices spoken softly in the dark.
One of the most important of these moments came during winter festivals, especially around Christmas in Christian Europe, or older seasonal traditions that blended into local customs over time. These celebrations were not grand in the way modern holidays might feel. They were simple, shaped by limited resources and the realities of winter life. But their meaning was deeply felt. For a short period, the usual strictness of winter survival eased slightly. Work slowed down, people gathered more freely. Homes that were usually quiet became a little more active, with neighbors visiting and families spending extended time together. Food, though still limited, was often prepared with more care during these days. If any special items were available, extra bread, preserved meat, or stored ingredients, they might be used to create a slightly richer meal than usual. Not abundant, but meaningful in contrast to everyday winter rationing. Light also played an important role in these moments. Candles, lamps, and hearth fires were used more deliberately, creating a warmer glow inside homes and small gathering spaces. Even in the cold, this soft light gave a sense of comfort that felt different from ordinary evenings. Music and simple singing were sometimes part of these gatherings, depending on region and tradition. Nothing elaborate, just familiar melodies or quiet voices shared among people who already knew each other well. Children often experienced these moments most strongly. A break from routine, a slightly different atmosphere, and the presence of more people created a feeling that the winter world had briefly changed. But even in celebration, winter never fully disappeared from awareness. The cold remained outside. Snow still covered the ground, and supplies still needed to be managed carefully. This balance is what made medieval winter festivals unique. They were not escapes from reality, but small pauses within it. Brief, fragile moments of relief before the season continued. And when the celebration ended, life gently returned to its usual rhythm. The fire became quieter again. The rooms grew still again. And winter, as always, continued its slow, steady presence.